It is a great privilege today to have Charlie here with us. He has, I don't know, would you say you were long-term at Swansea?
I was there almost 11 years.
That's good enough for long-term. As the pastor of our mother church.
It is a privilege to stand here to help with this celebration. Our congregations have, for several years now, been in close communion with each other, as is fitting that tradition which we celebrate. Here we are 250 years after the beginning of this congregation. And there are 5 words I want to use to describe what I think is appropriate to say in these moments. Context, connection, conduit, charge, and challenge. The context. Today, the Baptist narrative is just over 400 years long, beginning sometime around 1608 in England. This year, in this region, this environment where the emergent nascent denomination began to take its form, we are marking significant anniversaries. First Baptist in Providence, 375 years. First Baptist in Swansea, 350. First Baptist, the Baptist Church in Warren, one gets into a rhythm, 250 years. 250 years. And at this moment, we can tell the Baptist story with more information at our disposal more than at any previous centenary celebrations. New research, new publications have brought to light a greater appreciation for how all the earliest streams of Baptist development came into being. Boston, Swansea, Newport, Providence, Charleston, South Carolina, and all the subsequent or associated instances. We also celebrate another stream that came from the First Baptist Church in Swansea, which is the Barrington Congregational Church, represented here this morning by their 8th and 9th grade class. All right. So today we have this new research. Van is one of these new researchers that helps us broaden and deepen our understanding of how those who came to be known as Baptists brought a radical heritage into historic reality, embedding their key theology into a system of government that we now hold dear, a heritage of tolerance and liberty of conscience. Today we can, in creating a more comparative description of the several streams which condensed into the earliest congregations, see the sources, the differentiations, the interactions, and the impacts of this heritage that we now celebrate. But there is yet a context in which we cannot avoid our own postmodern moment. For now the church as a whole, once robust and hugely influential, struggles. The world into which our congregations were born is not the world to which we are now called to minister, but a substantially different one, both more complex and more connected. If we were only to celebrate our past, proclaim past glories, we would be wasting our time this morning. Our response to the perplexities of this very changed world should be to retrieve what treasure lies in our past, seizing on our story, our self-describing story, and mining it for the values that it contains, values that are still both transformative and powerful. Our task then is to bring them, those memories, from the storehouse to re-implement them for use, real and powerful use in our own moment. There is a deep and intimate connection, second word, connection, between the Swansea congregation and this venerable congregation in Warren. It's probably familiar to most of you. We sometimes speak of the mother-daughter relationship, but originally it was described as a distant sister, 3.5 miles. But there was a state line involved. No bridges. We have shared 3 pastors over our histories. Charles Thompson, his plaque is right there, Luther Baker, and Silas Hall. Our covenants are written with the same language and the same theology, save one point. We'll get to that later. But we would offer today that it is also a most unique relationship that these 2 congregations share, and one that is centrally connected to the flow of Baptist development in the American colonies and subsequently throughout our nation's history. The details of the narrative begin as they were written in our very oldest records. This is the moment of conception. It did not happen in 1764. It happened 2 years earlier when the note in our records read, "At a church meeting on the 4th day of November, 1762, the brethren at Warren," spelled W-O-R-I-N, "brought a request to the church, desiring liberty to embody into a church in the same order and faith as the First Baptist Church in Swansea is, and desired the assistance of the church that we may all be united in love of the same household of faith and order." Then are described in some detail the process and the procedures that led on October 4th, 1764, for the Swansea congregation to meet and declare that they had considered the request in calling to mind the answer of our Lord to the woman of Samaria, which we just read, after this manner, that neither at Jerusalem nor in this mountain shall men be compelled, C-U-M-P-E-L-D, spelling was not big back then, to worship the Father, but that they that worship God must worship him in spirit and in truth. And as we desire to stand fast in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, so we are willing that our brethren should enjoy the same. And so it was done. Then in a quick step, yet orderly manner, the Warren Church organized itself, formed a committee, and called a pastor. His name, James Manning. James Manning had been, according to Myron Dean, a star pupil that some in the Philadelphia Association, which was founded in 1707, had been eyeing. Here was a star. Those Baptists in the area around Philadelphia had also come from the churches founded by John Miles, our founding pastor, and were of a like mind with the Boston, Swansea, Newport Baptists, who were Calvinist in contrast to the then General Six Principle Baptists who were worshiping in Providence. These Baptists from the Philadelphia Association were inclined to a learned clergy and wanted a school that would not discriminate but would encourage Baptist thinking, a place to educate Baptist leaders and pastors. Knowing the success of the Baptists in this area, the Philadelphia folks moved to find a place to begin such a school, the place we now know as Warren. Warren had grown and prospered after the threat of the Wampanoag hostilities was removed around 1680. Moving down the peninsula into Brooks pasture, a new town of trade was created along the neck of land that was inhabited at one time by the indigenous peoples. And the English folks moved in and became prosperous and ready for a great task. James Manning was called to this task, became the pastor, and immediately set forth to accomplish the tasks of church and college. But in 6 short years, he left with the college and a call to the First Baptist Church in Providence, leaving the people in Warren hurt and wondering. But this awkward transition provided the next moments of development and influence in the Baptist story. We pause at this moment in history to remind ourselves that this was a time not only of increasing prosperity, but also increasing tensions with the old world in England. While the money had begun to move up the river to the city of Providence, the increasing prosperity of the colonies stirred new interest in the money-strapped English kingdom. The War of Revolution was about to alter many things. As Manning left, the Warren Church called a valedictorian of the first class of the College of Rhode Island, now known as Brown University, Charles Thompson. A major talent, Thompson began to revive the Warren congregation and brighten its future. That is, until the war came to Warren. The meeting house and the parsonage were destroyed. The pastor was put in jail. The congregation scattered. But in this horrific crisis, the Swansea congregation opened its arms and doors, and what possibly is the most unique of ecclesiastical events transpired. The pastor and the congregation came back into the parent congregation with an intentional aspiration to send them forth again when possible. This second intertwining has resulted in a deep connection and a sacred appreciation for each other within the conscious relationship of these two seminal congregations. Third word, conduit. Let me back up a bit to Manning and his departure from Warren and why this is important. As I've been trying to trace the influence of the earliest Baptists, we discovered that there was a mother church in London, in England, with which the Boston, Swansea, and Newport congregations all had direct connections. It was called the Glasshouse Church, and in its membership were early Baptists like William Consett and William Kiffin. This was the church to which John Miles went in 1649. This was the church to which Obadiah Holmes corresponded after his whipping in 1651. That was the church with whom John Clark most likely communed while he was working on the 1663 charter, which we also celebrate this year. It was at the head of the Calvinist stream, a stream of influence that flowed into the colonies through the Boston, Swansea, Newport connections and through the Philadelphia Association. When the Warren Association was formed, after the model of the Philadelphia Association, Manning and others in Warren allowed the Calvinist stream to form into the to flow into the formal associations of like-minded Calvinistic Christians. And when Manning arrives in Providence, he brings Calvinism to that congregation, even though he did maintain relationships with the General Sixth Principle Baptists, like the Second Baptist Church in Swansea, which is now a congregational church, by the way. At that point, when Manning came to Providence, the Calvinistic model began to dominate that moment of the Revolutionary War, requiring a learned pastor, strong deacons, a significant meeting house for social respectability, an orderly discipline. The Providence Church didn't even keep notes of their meetings until 1760 or 1770 when Manning came. But it also became a time of political cooperation and influence. But the outflow of our common history does not confine itself to particular religious scenarios. It emerges from the closely held Baptist value of education, both religious and secular. Faunce, who was then the president of Brown, wrote in 1913, "Here in Rhode Island, the college that was founded at Warren was the true offspring of the Christian church. It began in the hearts and the minds of the Baptists of New Jersey, and it was received with open arms by their brethren here in Rhode Island. The old First Baptist Meeting House in Providence, as we know, was erected for the worship of God and to hold commencement in. Thus the fathers built the college and the church under one roof." Notice how they skipped over the Swansea piece here. They didn't even say a lot about Warren at this point. The stream of educational development, though, flowed through the Brown graduates, the school beginning here, to establish many other institutions of higher learning: Colgate, Williams, Amherst, Dartmouth, Rochester, Chicago, Kalamazoo, Franklin, Bates, Colby, and many others. Baptists were dedicated and committed to real education. Faunce suggests two key consequences. The first is about religion and science, that within the context of public teaching, there should be a general respect for science. Of course, in the middle of the 18th century, that was not true. When in 1765 the schools were in that generative mode, the study of science was deemed hurtful to morals and religion alike, a tension that still exists in our society. The educational values then put forward by Faunce led to greater discoveries and greater science. This value was undergirded by the second and more important one stated in the charter of the school. Into this liberal and Catholic, with a small c, institution shall never be admitted any religious tests, but on the contrary, all the members hereof shall forever enjoy full, free, absolute, and uninterrupted liberty of conscience. This worked, of course, until the need for the freedom of academic inquiry smacked up against the religious conservatism of the Baptists in the early part of the 20th century, that modernist fundamentalist controversy, and Brown separated itself from the Baptists. A charge. What I've attempted here to describe is the flow of God's creative spirit from the springs of the old world's religious crises, still spewing forth chunks of the Reformation's zealous volcano. And central to this Baptist chunk, a challenge given articulation by the Swansea congregation's words to the newly formed Warren congregation. And grant them liberty to embody into visible gospel church order and set up a discipline amongst them according to the rules of Christ revealed in the gospel. It is this treasure, this liberty, that we should claim today for ourselves, but only if we really understand what it is and what consequences it predicts. Our scripture this morning came from the text given reference in the notes written on the occasion of the going out of the Warren congregation. It references John's account of the interaction between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. Now, John certainly was expressing his understanding of what it means to be free in the sense that Jesus was proclaiming then. And it was this sense of profound freedom, of spiritual liberty experienced through the living heritage that was at the moment birthing a new congregation and prompting the note. Today, that freedom is too often so taken for granted that it is commonly abused or simply forgotten. Today, the scripture should remind us of at least two important concepts. The first is how this Jesus liberty and the freedom that belief in Jesus engenders is not confined to any social order or religious parameters. Jesus amazed his disciples for speaking to a woman. Contrary to his own culture, contrary to the expectations of his own disciples, Jesus crosses the invisible boundaries of social convention and prejudice with such power that even yet today we see the struggle for gender equality making more and more progress. Jesus did not limit his free actions to casual moments, but built his organization with an inclusive spirit that put women at the operational center of his movement. Though Jesus did it long ago, there are still congregations and denominations that have not yet grasped this profound liberty. Even though Brown has had women presidents and our congregations have had significant women pastors. The second, though perhaps less visible gem, is contained in this thought. The hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. But the hour is coming and is now here when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. This statement disconnects religious practice from place and particularities. Jesus was refocusing religious practice from the time-bound traditions and freeing it into a transcendent realm in which spiritual worth is given through the unique spiritual qualities of human beings. The ability to search, to reflect, to require passionately after the truth. Again, Jesus offers liberation from the narrowness of prescribed formula and rote ritual. The disconnect directs each worshiper to a praxis of spiritual development and liberates each one to understand there is yet discovery on our spiritual journey. These disconnects allow disciples of Jesus then and now to question doctrine, challenge authorities, both religious and secular, and take the riskier path promised by the freedoms intrinsic in the search for truth, both scientific and spiritual. We have but to review the stream of history from the founding of the faith in the first century through the moments of Reformation that produced our precious heritage of those who are seekers of real freedom based on the truths of the gospel, that in loving our neighbors, we love God. And because we love God, all human beings are our neighbors. We who are Baptists hold high our heroes, men and women who with great courage fought for freedom of conscience and that precious child, political freedom. So from Jesus to John Calvin to Obadiah Holmes to John Miles to Sojourner Truth to James Manning to Adoniram and Ann Judson to Martin Luther King Jr., Baptists fed by the stream of living water have been at the forefront of the struggle to free the human mind, body, and spirit. Challenge. Here is the challenge for us. How in this day, in the year 2014, in the postmodern era, how can we bring forth a visible witness of a people who have been charged to stand fast in the liberty that Jesus provided for us. Certainly, we do not want to be like those cracked cisterns referenced by the prophet Jeremiah. We should be careful not to spill or leak our heritage from a weak understanding. We need to hold that living water that others may drink. We need to hold our holy heritage so that it becomes a liberating resource for all of humanity. We need to commit ourselves to the practice of liberty, the liberty that Jesus proclaims for us. Having come of age in the 1960s with its turmoil and its liberation movements, we know that liberty is frightening, even if it does sound a little attractive. For we have seen the violence, even on the television this morning, that comes with the challenge of seeking liberty. Black liberation, women's liberation, gay liberation, economic and political liberation, all have had their violent struggles. From the road to Selma to Matthew Shepard to the Arab Spring, people fight and die for the very thought of real liberty. But liberty demands change, often dramatic and divisive, and almost any change is met reluctantly. But if we can be as free as Jesus was and still calls us to be, we can embrace the possibilities of positive and profound change. Today, I think the real religious freedom would help us reform the institutions of the church, free us from the struggle of buildings and budgets and relentless reprogramming, free us to choose new forms and explore new relationships, free us from the drudgery of running the church to the joy of being loving neighbors, free us from the anxieties of right or wrong to the confidence of compassionate service. Free us from all boundaries we place on ourselves because of our pasts to the exciting explorations of that which is yet to be. Today we may think that freedom of conscience is a freedom granted to all, but we would fool ourselves with such a thought. Freedom of conscience applies to many, many of the issues in our society and that our world faces today. Same-gender marriage and reproductive rights, all manners of war from Syria to the Ukraine, to the drone issues, economic inequality, which is still racially tinged and plutocratically controlled, from ancient pre-scientific doctrines ignorantly held by even some within our own denomination, to the anti-intellectualism of the religion of spectator sports. Even within the vaunted halls of academia, which I've been privileged to join recently, religion is denigrated and dismissed as anachronistic and irrelevant, even though it is alive around the world and is the very source of the freedom of conscience. Freedom of conscience is the very distillation of our Baptist heritage that flows through us. Yet it is one that is easily given up when any one of us forgets to exercise it. When we fear that speaking out about an important issue will bring us social approbation. When we don't read and study our history. When we don't listen to critical thinking or challenge ourselves to new thinking. When we think that we are free in our thoughts without understanding how the media shape our behaviors, from the foods that we snack on to the colleges we send our children to. That freedom that Jesus promises us is given visibility when we act publicly to proclaim freedom and act freely for every other human being. Public statements are what push freedom into the consciousness of the unfree. Public actions push the oppressors to change and invite to the freedom in which we now stand steady. Public statements do invite controversy and debate, the kinds of controversy and debate that have, in our Baptist past, led to great moments of toleration and the institution of assured freedoms. We should be glad today, very glad, that our Baptist forebears did not make the same mistake that so many make easily today, that the separation of church and state was the same as disengagement of religious faith from politics. I believe, having been nurtured all my life in the Baptist heritage, that we are not simply freed from the past by this Jesus liberty, but freed for the present and into a good future. Acting as persons free within our faith in the eternal presence of God, we should never be afraid of the loss of the familiar and the comfortable. But we should be afraid of the loss of any new opportunity to work that which glorifies our loving God through greater freedoms brought visibly into our society. Today, the words of James Manning should resonate in our hearts, for these words could be applied today. Surely no one whose bosom feels the patriot's glow in behalf of civil liberty can remain torpid in the more ennobling flame of religious freedom. The free exercise of private judgment and the unalienable rights of conscience are of too high a rank and dignity to be subjected to the decrees of councils or the imperfect laws of fallible legislators. We claim and expect the liberty of worshiping God according to our consciences. If our anniversary celebrations are to accomplish anything more than stirring the dust of history, our Christ-founded liberty should begin again to disturb our society from its moral turpitude, provide new and relevant insight and guidance to the young people of these next generations, encouraging them to be as free as were their forebears, those ancient leaders who began as outliers and outlaws, but were to accomplish the institutions of freedoms that still inspire the world today. We have two mighty traditions, faith and learning, flowing from the universities of the old world into the liberating values of the postmodern church. If we are to take up the challenge to stand fast in the liberty Christ has given us, into which Christ has freed us, it is now our responsibility to keep ourselves in this living stream and develop our Baptist heritage openly, visibly, freely as did those who went before. Fonts, in his 1913 discussion of education, leaves us with this appropriate question: what attitude then shall the church take?